15. I went downstairs and got a bottle of good red wine from my father's cellar, then sat at the oak table in the kitchen. I poured myself a glass. Then, after a moment's hesitation, I got a second glass from the cupboard, poured a measure of wine into that, and placed it carefully on the table across from me. Then I sat down and stared at the chair opposite until I could almost see my father sitting there. It was the same technique I'd employed throughout the day, but I made it more deliberate now, more concentrated. As before, there was no magic to it. It wasn't like conjuring a ghost. Any answers I received would only ever come from inside me, but that in itself could be revealing, because the subconscious often catches its fingertips on textures that the conscious mind skims over. "What's happening here?" I asked my father. A moment of silence. And then, "That's a very good question, my son. Why don't you talk us both through it? First principles, right? First principles, right? First principles," I thought. "Yes. What is happening is that you found the remains of a dead woman in the woods. Someone took a photograph of you standing there at that moment and then delivered it to you." "Sure. And we have to assume that was the killer, don't we?" "Yes, I think it has to be." "Tell me about the photograph?" "It was taken from a particular vantage point," I thought. "You realized that just like I did, and when you went up there you found a wallet belonging to a man named Darren Field." "I did." I imagined my father nodding. It looked like it had been placed there to me. It wasn't an accident, more like a breadcrumb on a trail. The intention was to lead the person who found it somewhere. "And so you followed that trail?" "I did. I went to Darren Field's address to talk to him, and the two of us had a chat. I mentioned the island, the woman, and then the very next day he vanished. And nobody's seen him since." "That's right. I knew better than to ask whether my father had been involved in Darren Field's disappearance. While it remained possible, I didn't want to accept that. Equally, there was no point in asking what he and Darren Field had spoken about that day. The island and the woman's body, I knew that much. I assumed my father would have wanted to know how Field's wallet had found its way to the campsite, but whatever Field might have told him was beyond the scope of the method I was using right now. My subconscious hadn't been there. Anything it told me now would only be guesswork. I looked down at my glass, and Darren Field was at the rest area that day. I imagined my father nodding again. I recognized his name pretty much straight away. "I'm guessing that you probably did too, right?" "No," I thought. "Actually, I didn't." "Really?" My father sounded surprised. I supposed that, given my obsession with the case as a teenager, he might have expected me to be an expert on every little detail. Once upon a time, I had been. But the truth was that I hadn't thought about the Pied Piper very much at all since I left the island. While I hadn't been able to bring myself to burn Terence O'Hara's book on that last night at the beach, I hadn't taken it with me to university either, and I hadn't read it since. I wasn't sure if that had been a conscious decision. All I knew was that at some point in my first year at university, detachment and calm had found me, and it had felt safe to be with them. Afterward, my work had helped me as well. However horrendous my patients' crimes might be, they were only men. There was no such thing as monsters, and no sense in revisiting a time when I had believed differently. "That's probably a good thing," my father said softly, "but I'm sure you would have made the connection eventually. You've always been very clever." I started turning the glass of wine between my hands. "What am I supposed to do now, Dad? Go to the police? I don't think that's a good idea, but hear me out, my son. Not yet, is what I mean." A part of me wanted to argue, but I recognized that there was a degree of sense to the answer I had provided him with. What exactly could I tell Fleming right now? And after our little altercation tonight, I was even more reluctant to talk to him than I had been before. Given our personal animosity, I could easily imagine what his reaction would be if I tried to explain any of this. He'd called me clever too, but to Fleming that was probably an insult. I was some kind of mind doctor, not a cop, and I suspected he would take great pleasure in telling me to stop playing at being one. I kept turning the glass. What then? I thought. What's the next step? Another good question. Maybe it's not a step you need so much as a leap, meaning you found one connection to the Pied Piper. Maybe there's another. No, I shook my head. What happened that day is ancient history. I wish that was true. He sounded sad. You can't just erase history like that, my son. You can look away. You can pretend it's over and done with. But it's always there. I stopped turning the glass. Then I looked up. The chair across from me was empty, of course, but I still imagined a presence lifting, as though my father were easing himself out of his seat. A moment later, the air in the kitchen seemed to lose weight, but it didn't feel like he was gone. It was more like he had stood up and left the room, wanting to lead me somewhere. I picked up the glass of wine and made my way upstairs to his room. The computer had gone into standby in my absence, so I re-entered the password and was met by the browser window still open on the website about the Pied Piper. You can't just erase history like that, my son. I opened a new tab and clicked on one of the menus at the top. It's always there. My father's internet history appeared before me now. There should have been a list of every site he'd visited recently, but aside from the website, there was only one. I frowned to myself. Was that really all there was? Or had he manually deleted everything else for some reason? There was no way of knowing. I clicked on the link to see what was left. An address search opened on the screen. Rosemary Saunders. The Blue Flower, Pitch 19, Newland Lock, Rampton. I stared at that for a moment. Rampton was the location of the rest area where I'd encountered the Pied Piper and Robbie Garforth. The address surely couldn't be a coincidence, and a part of me recognized the woman's name too, even though it took a few seconds for me to remember where from. I clicked back to the tab about the Pied Piper and scrolled a little way down. I don't know if he was talking to himself, Rose Saunders told the police afterward. But he definitely wasn't speaking to me. There was something scary about him, so I acted like I was busy, and I was just glad when I looked up and he was gone. I read through the rest of the page, searching out the details of the other people who had been present at the rest area that day. Rose Saunders was the only female name I could see listed. I felt my father's presence solidifying in the air again. Like I told you, he said. A leap. I stared at the address on the screen. You thought this might be her, I thought. The woman in the woods? Well, there were already 2 links to the Pied Piper, he said, and both of them were connected to the remains of a woman who nobody had been able to identify. It made sense to follow up on that, if only to rule out the possibility. I nodded to myself. It did. But then I realized what he'd just said. There were already 2 links, I thought. Silence for a moment. The air was ringing. Dad? I prompted. Are you sure you want me to answer that, my son? You left all this behind you for a reason. I was glad that you did, and perhaps that's why I made this trail hard for you to follow, so that you'd have to choose to do it, so you'd know what you were getting yourself into, because it might be dangerous. Tell me, I thought. He sighed quietly. Do you remember what I said to Sarah? The ringing in the air went up in pitch, and then disappeared. Yes, I remembered. He had told her it was a good thing it had been him who found the woman's remains in the woods. Better him than a tourist, that had been the rationale. But thinking about that now, who else could have found her? Earlier today, I had wondered why the killer would make the effort to carry the body out into the woods, only to leave it where it would be discovered so easily. But my father's routine in retirement had been predictable. He had walked that same trail through the woods every morning, and anyone familiar enough with him would have known that. 2 connections. Darren Field, my father. I reached down to the computer and scrolled a little way up the page, back to the photograph of Robbie Garforth that I had found at the rest area that day, and I thought about the boy I had seen there that day. Despite my initial doubts, I had convinced myself that it must have been Robbie too. Because how could it be anyone else? How was it possible that another boy had disappeared without anyone ever noticing or caring? And then I felt a different presence behind me. The figure at my back remained opaque for the moment, still little more than a shade hanging in the air, But when I shifted angles in my subconscious to allow it a voice, it spoke more strongly now than it had this morning on the crag. You thought I wanted to be seen, it told me. And you were right. But not just by anyone. I waited. I wanted to be seen by you. James, August 1998. Click. James is lying on the dirty mattress when the key turns in the lock. The sound makes him draw his knees up to his chest. It's instinctive. It won't do anything to protect him. But when faced with danger, we all have a desire to curl up, to make ourselves small and unseen. The door opens slowly. In the first few months after he was brought here, James was kept in one of the wooden pens outside, tethered by his ankle to a post in the ground. He would lie there shivering at night under a black sky full of implacable stars, and there were moments when he thought he would die, and then ones in which he thought he might already have. But at some point in the last few weeks, the man had brought him inside. Now he sleeps up here, in a small, windowless room on the first floor of the house. It had been a relief at first. And yet there was also the crawling sensation that all of this was happening by design. That the man had waited until a part of James really had died outside, lost somewhere between winter and spring, and that the man was now intending to fill the gap that dead part had left. The door creaks to a halt. It's pitch black in the room, so whenever he's locked in here, it's impossible to tell if it's day or night. But there's a window at the far end of the hallway outside the door, and the dim light in the corridor right now suggests to James that it's either dawn or dusk. He doesn't know which. Time is difficult to keep track of. It feels like the man usually only keeps him locked in here overnight, but James has the impression that he has been left alone for longer this time. That's not good, because despite the fear and horror, he is alive. The man hasn't killed him, but any shift in routine could mean that is about to change. The man steps into the doorway. As always, James avoids looking at his face. The man doesn't like that, but the truth is that there is nothing to see there anyway. Even lying in the darkness with nothing to distract him, James finds it impossible to picture his features. Ever since that first day at the beach, he has been a black space in James's mind, not so much a presence as an absence. The man is as vast and unfathomable as that night sky outside. But even out of the corner of his eye, James can see it. The man is usually empty-handed when he arrives on a morning. There have been times when he brings a camera with him, a bulky old Polaroid contraption. He will hear a click and a whir and then become aware of the man wafting the photograph in the air. But today, he's holding a knife. James closes his eyes quickly. Instinct again. If we can't see the monster, then it isn't really there. That was something his mother used to say sometimes when he woke up scared in the night. A lot of growing up, she'd tell him, gently stroking his forehead, is about pretending there's no such thing as monsters until you eventually realize that it's true. Except she was wrong. There is such a thing. His heart patters in his chest. "Get up," the man says. "Follow me." Despite his fear, James knows better than to disobey. "Yes, sir." And when he opens his eyes, the man is already gone. James listens to the heavy sound of his footfalls moving away down the corridor, then scrabbles quickly off the mattress and through the doorway. The man's enormous frame fills the hallway ahead. He leads James past the closed doors up here, then downstairs, then through the stale, smoky air of the front room, and then outside. Something about the quality of the light in the trees tells James that it's nearly dawn, and he blinks a little as he follows the man down the wooden steps from the house's rickety porch. The camper van is parked at an angle in front of him. Beyond the vehicle, the rest of the farm stretches away, still draped for now in the night's receding shadows. The farm. James always thinks of it as that, even though it's really a compound, somewhere deep in the woods, with tight webs of barbed wire strung between the trees. There are wire cages in which the man keeps chickens, and a row of wooden pens where emaciated animals are tied to posts. The air stinks of petrol from the generator that's constantly putt-putting away close to the tree line. A farm, though. It's easier to think of it as that than some of the other things he might call it. Prison, the place he's going to die. The man walks around the side of the camper van, striding confidently over the dry ground, his boots raising misty puffs of dust. He's holding the knife loosely down by his side, and he doesn't look back, because even though he's leading James to his death right now, he also knows he'll follow. And James does, of course, because what choice does he have? There's nowhere to hide here, no chance of escape, no use in shouting for help, because nobody is coming to save him. He remembers his first few days here at the farm. Back then, he had tried to convince himself it was a nightmare that he would wake up from soon. When he accepted it was real, he still thought it was going to end, because the police would be looking for him, wouldn't they? He remembered the shows he and his mother used to watch on their little television, the ones in which the detective never gave up hope, and the victim was always rescued in time. Away from the farm, the whole world knew that James was gone, and so everyone would be searching for him. His father might never have replied to the letter James wrote, but his mother wouldn't forget about him. She wasn't going to rest until she found him and brought him back home where he belonged. You and me against the world, James. But then the days passed, and then the weeks, and nobody came for him. During that period, there were times when the man left the farm. On each occasion, James had watched the old camper van disappearing down the trail between the trees, waited until the sound of its engine had faded, and then screamed with all the strength he could muster, calling out for his parents, shouting for someone, anyone, to come in and save him. But his calls disappeared into the trees, and his voice failed him, and there was only ever the insistent putt-putting of the generator in reply. And each time, it was only the man who returned. Nobody sees, and nobody cares. He follows the man across the farm now, past the lines of wooden pens where the animals stand motionless inside, toward the empty pen all the way down at the end, the one closest to the woods, which used to be where he slept. Its gate is open. Perhaps the man has decided to move him back out here? Perhaps that's all that's happening? Except he knows it isn't, because the man is turning the knife around in his hand, and there's a sense of purpose to him, a kind of dark energy buzzing around him like flies. There's a dirty old shovel leaning against the post in the center. James falters. Even with his back to him, the man seems to register it. "Get in there," he says. "Pick up the shovel." James walks past him slowly, and then into the pen. He takes hold of the shovel. He can barely lift it. The wooden handle is old and soft, but the metal blade at the bottom is heavy. It's caked with mud and rust. "Start digging," the man says. James stares down at the surface of the ground, and he wants to cry. He doesn't need to be told what he's digging here. It's his own grave. But the thing that sickens him the most is how ashamed he is, because he feels so weak, and the earth here is hard and solid. His shoulders begin to hitch a little as he tries to keep the tears in. How worthless he is. Everyone has forgotten him. All that's left is the man, and all the man wants is this one final thing from him, and he can't even manage to do that right. "Start digging," the man repeats. James gathers himself together. He plants the tip of the shovel against the earth as best he can, looks at the metal edge at the top of the blade, and then he stamps down on it with the arch of his bare foot as hard as he can. As James digs his own grave over the next few hours, he forgets about the pain in his body, the trembling muscles, the heat of the sun as it begins to burn his shoulders, the fact that his right foot is so badly hurt now that it won't support his weight. He's determined to do this. He will keep going. The whole time, the man is whistling softly behind him. The tune is the same one as always, as maddening and strange as ever. James hates the way that it has begun to worm its way into his mind. Every night in the darkness of his room, it plays in his head, and sometimes he's even found himself humming it without realizing. It's as though the tune is an infection that's gradually spreading to him from the man. He doesn't want it to be the last thing he ever hears, but he knows it will be. Eventually, the whistling stops. James assumes that's the man's way of signaling that he's done enough, and that the grave is ready. With his hair bedraggled and sweat running down his face, He leans on the spade and looks down at the hole before him. A shiver of pride runs through him. His body is weak and the ground is hard, but he's done a good job. The hole is long and deep, and he's so exhausted now that he just wants to lie down in it, and for this all finally to be over. Except, that's not quite true. He looks up at the sun streaming through the mist between the trees, and for a moment he thinks he sees his mother standing there, half illuminated by a ray of light. It's only his imagination, a vision driven by the delirium. He knows that. But he still feels a small fire burning inside him. He wants to go home. He doesn't want this monster to beat him. He wants to live so very badly. He leans there, breathing heavily, his body trembling. Waiting. From back up the farm, he hears the sound of the camper van door slamming shut, and he realizes the man is no longer standing behind him. He hadn't even been aware of him moving. But that's no surprise. It's one of the powers the man has. He seems able to appear and disappear at will. James risks glancing in that direction, and what he sees there catches his breath. The man is walking back toward him again. As always, his face is a black absence, but James's gaze is drawn instead to the figure beside him. The little boy that the man is dragging by the arm. With his heart pounding, James looks down at the hole he has dug. Not his own grave at all. The relief that understanding brings washes through him like ice-cold water. But it also brings a burst of shame. He only saw the boy for a second, and he looked nothing like James, but it still feels as though he was seeing a reflection of himself. But he's done a good job, hasn't he? He needs to cling to that. He is still alive. A part of him knows that's what the man wants him to think, that there is a purpose to everything he's doing. That out of all the words James might use to describe this place, the worst one of all might be this, home. But all that, along with the shame, is overwhelmed by the relief. He is still alive. He hears the man and the boy approaching, and as he looks up again at the trees ahead of him, he sees that his mother is gone now. Part 3. Bargaining. 16. Dawn was breaking as I arrived at the ferry terminal the next morning. I stood out on the deck, watching the gulls wheeling above, like calligraphy etched onto the rose-gold sky. The sea air was freezing, and within minutes I was shivering from the cold. Bracing, I reminded myself, and God knew I needed that this morning. I had slept badly, and the takeaway coffee I was holding was barely warming my hands, never mind taking the edge off my tiredness. When we reached the mainland, I followed the instructions on the GPS as I drove. The journey took me down a stretch of motorway that I had always been able to avoid until now, but half an hour later, I found myself driving along it for the first time in decades. My heart began beating harder as I approached the exit to the Rampton rest area. The site was occluded by trees, but my skin started to crawl as I reached it, and then a sick feeling settled inside me as I looked up and watched it disappear behind in the rearview mirror. Because it felt like I'd picked up a passenger. Please help me. The voice from the back seat was not the same one I'd imagined last night. That had been the voice of a killer, whereas this was that of a child, scared and desperate. I made sure to keep a careful grip on the steering wheel. The presence behind me wasn't real. Please help me. I kept up with the traffic in front. If you'd help me, then none of this would be happening. Concentrate, I told myself. It was just the old guilt surfacing. The idea that if I'd only acted differently, then everything would be better. And that wouldn't help me right now. A woman had been murdered. Leaving aside the identity of the killer for the moment, the circumstances around her death allowed me to make a handful of tentative deductions. Killers could be categorized in a number of different ways, one of which referenced the level of planning that went into the crime. A murderer might be organized or disorganized, for example, or some mixture of the two. Disorganized killers acted on impulse, made mistakes, and were generally easier to catch. But if the body had been left in the woods for my father to find, and the killer had arranged to take a photograph and deliver it to him, that suggested the opposite, an intelligent and highly organized offender. A man who had done precisely what he set out to do, made no mistakes, and left behind only the evidence that he wanted to be found. The hardest to catch. Rampton. I took the exit and then followed the directions through a series of ever-winnowing residential roads. The presence behind me disappeared, and a short while later, I parked on a dusty spread of land at the edge of the canal. Newland Lock. It was a few ramshackle buildings clustered in a circle, all of them shuttered up and closed. I got out of the car. Nobody in sight. Everything silent. A crooked wooden lock spanned the water, the sides adorned by blackened cogs that reminded me of rusted clockwork. I crossed it carefully, the wood soft and fragile beneath my feet, a trickle of water spattering out quietly far below. All the barges here were moored a little way ahead, tethered to iron rings in the ground by thick ropes, and lined up bow to stern along the bank like rides in an out-of-season fairground attraction. Most of them were weathered and ancient, their small gray windows cracked and webbed. But when I reached Plot 19, I saw that the vessel moored there was in better repair than its neighbors. The sides had been decorated with painted flowers, but also with ornaments glued to the wood, dried flowers pressed behind glass in frames, plastic boxes of seashells, a battered acoustic guitar. The barge looked rickety but cozy, resting in the water like some decades-old arts and crafts project. A man was sitting on a chair outside on the deck. He was in his 50s, long white hair swept back in a ponytail, and he was wearing a black waistcoat dappled with paint and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Apparently, he was oblivious to the cold morning air. Or perhaps to everything, I thought. Because even though he was holding a cup, the expression on his face as he stared down at the water suggested he might have forgotten it was there. I stopped on the bank. "Excuse me," I called up. The man turned his head to look at me, but his blank expression didn't alter. As his gaze settled on me, it was like he wasn't really seeing me, and when he spoke he sounded weary. "What do you want?" "I was looking for Rose Saunders," I said. "Does she live here?" The name focused him slightly, bringing him back into his own head a little. While he didn't answer me immediately, it was obvious it meant something to him. "Rose," he said finally. "Or Rosemary?" "No, always just Rose. That's important." He frowned to himself. "And what exactly do you want with my Rose?" I hadn't prepared an elaborate story in advance, because I hadn't known what I would find here. But given that the address had been in my father's search history, it felt safe to make at least one assumption. "Because I think my father might have come to see her," I said. The man said nothing for a few seconds. His gaze moved steadily over my face, trying to focus, trying to remember. "The policeman," he said. I hesitated, but my father would have needed a way in. And if that was what he had decided to tell this man, then I supposed it had been close enough to the truth. "Yes," I said. "He was a policeman. You look like him, you know." "I'm not sure that I do." But the man nodded slowly anyway, then looked away. The focus he had briefly gained was already drifting a little, and as the silence panned out, I wondered if there was something stronger in his cup than tea or coffee. I was about to prompt him when he finally spoke. "My Rose is gone," he said. Then he sighed and eased himself carefully to his feet. "So I suppose you'd better come inside." The man's name was Brian Gill, and he was Rose Saunders's partner. Or at least, he had been. There was a clock mounted to the wall of the barge, and I found myself staring at it as he spoke. The clock had stopped at 8:34, although I had no idea on what day. But the second hand was stuttering in place, and there was something mesmerizing about each little flicker. "It was a couple of months ago," Gill said. "That was the first time Rose disappeared." "What happened?" I said. "She went out one morning, the way she always did. The library in town. The park. But she didn't come back. Rose had always been a free spirit. She liked her space. But it had been a few years since she'd gone off on her own, and it wasn't like her not to let me know where she was. Did you talk to the police? Yes, the next morning, but they didn't take it seriously, and then she came back that evening, except that she was different from before. Droplets of white paint had congealed and dried on the edge of the table between us. I glanced down the galley. The remains of old flowers were scattered on a makeshift counter there. They had probably been fresh when Rose first gathered them, but they were dark and brittle now, like leaves blown into the corner of an abandoned garage. I looked back at Gil. Where had she been? I said. Gil explained it falteringly. When Rose returned to him after that first disappearance, she was shaken and disturbed. She had been kidnapped the day before, she told him. She couldn't remember the details, just that there had been a bench and a man whose face she couldn't recall, and then everything had gone misty. The next thing she knew, she was in the woodland somewhere, tied down and unable to move, facing a makeshift animal pen. There was a man in there, Gil told me. He was chained to a post. Did she describe him? No. Gil shook his head. She couldn't because of what happened next, and she couldn't tell me much about that either. But the man who had taken her killed the other man. That was all she was sure of. He made her watch it, and whatever happened was so horrible that she couldn't remember it afterward. I waited. And then, Gil said, he let her go. The next thing she recalled, he told me, she was back on a bench in the park, disorientated and a little disheveled, but otherwise unharmed. It was as though she had blinked out of the world for 36 hours and then reappeared. Everything was the same as it had been apart from the visceral images, the trauma that her abductor had left her with, and the decision that she remembered he had given her. The man told her that if she kept what had happened to herself, then she would never see him again, Gil said. Her life would continue as it always had. She'd be safe. But if she went to the police and reported what she'd seen, he would come for her. He would take her back to that place again, and she would be the one to die next. I thought about my next question carefully. There was something obvious I wanted to ask, given the nature of what I'd just been told, but it seemed better to approach it from a respectful angle. Did you believe her story? I said. He nodded to himself. Not to say that he did, but acknowledging what I was actually asking. I told you that Rose was eccentric, he said. The truth is that she was ill a number of times over the years. She was sectioned by the authorities on 4 different occasions that I know of, each time because she suffered a break with reality. When Rose was ill, she said a lot of things that weren't true. So when she told me this, I thought it might be the same thing, that she was getting sick again and needed help. That's understandable. No, it isn't. Because the thing is, she was never lying to me. All those times over the years, it was always real to her. And if you imagine that you're scared or in pain, then you really are, aren't you? Yes, I said. That's true. So even if I didn't believe her, he said, I had to believe in her. I had to try to support her and do what was best. And she wanted to go to the police. Yes, because that was the right thing to do. Despite the threat, she had been adamant that she had to report what happened to her. Rose, Gil told me, had been a woman who felt things deeply, that the murdered man deserved justice, that the killer had to be caught and punished, that the system would protect her, and that if the police didn't believe her, she would make them. I drove her to the police station, Gil said. I waited in the car. Not long after, an officer came out and tapped on the window. He wanted me to go inside to help them calm her down, which I tried to. She was raging, desperate, panicked. It was touch and go whether they were going to call a doctor there and then. Having dealt with patients with similar histories in the past, I had a degree of sympathy for the authorities for their response. You could only work with the facts available to you. The story Rose had given them was extraordinary. She had a documented history of mental illness, and her behavior in that moment would have led them to a conclusion that was perfectly reasonable, especially given that the alternative explanation, that her story was true, seemed so wild and unlikely. They didn't believe her, I said. And then she disappeared again? A couple of weeks afterward. She went out for a walk and didn't come back. I went to the police again, of course, but they didn't take her story any more seriously than they had before. They assumed she would come back, like she had other times. And then, when she didn't, they made certain assumptions. Yes. There was an appeal. Did you see it? I shook my head. No, Gil said. Of course you didn't. There hasn't been much coverage, and most of it was down south. She lived there for a while, you see. The police think she's left me and is staying somewhere with friends. Maybe that's true. No, they're just sweeping her under the carpet. They're not interested. Because of the type of woman she was. No steady employment. No real social network. Just living here on this boat with me for years, as off the grid as we could manage. Someone like my Rose was never going to be front-page news. Never anyone's priority. He grimaced and took a sip of whatever was in his mug. Then he closed his eyes. Nobody cares, he said. The light in the barge seemed to darken at that. It was only my imagination, but it was as though someone had stepped into the galley behind me, and I felt a tickle at the back of my neck. I glanced over my shoulder. There was nobody there, of course. Concentrate, I told myself. Think. However right Gil might have been about certain people slipping through the cracks, he was wrong about at least one thing. But my father came here, I said quietly. Gil's breathing was growing shallow now. He was falling asleep in front of me. Yes, he said. He did. For some reason it felt important to emphasize that point. Even though Gil couldn't see me, I leaned forward, determined to press it. So he cared. Suppose. And you told him Rose's story? Just as you've told it to me? Gil didn't open his eyes but frowned slightly. He already knew. He knew. Working her case, wasn't he? And then he started snoring. Yes, I said quietly. He was. Gil still had the mug clasped loosely against his solar plexus. I stood up and took it away from him, putting it on the small table between us. He grumbled, the way I imagined an infant might, but his eyes remained shut. I went back outside into the sunlight. The brightness and fresh air were a shock at first. I hadn't realized how dismal and stale it had been back there in the barge. I looked down at one of the small gray windows on the side, and a swirl of grime on the glass threatened to resolve itself into a face. I turned my head away quickly and made my way back toward the lock, imagining my father following a few steps behind me. You told him you were police? I thought. Well, I might have done. Or perhaps I hinted that I was to get him to talk to me. Or maybe he just assumed. Who knows? I kicked at the dust on the path in frustration, but I did know one thing for certain. To the extent that there had been an investigation into Rose Saunders' disappearance, my father had been nowhere near it. I also doubted he had any friendly local contacts to call on who would have provided him with the details. And yet, Gil told me you already knew Rose's story, Dad. He did, didn't he? But how could you have? That's a good question, isn't it? Maybe work through it from those first principles of yours. Assuming what Rose Saunders had told Gil was true, she had been abducted and forced to watch a man being murdered. If she reported what had happened to the police, then the same thing would happen to her. And when she did so anyway, because it was the right thing to do, she was not believed. Nobody had listened to her. Nobody had cared. And the killer, true to his word, had returned and taken her. My father prompted me, sounding impatient. But what happened next? A woman's body was left by a trail in the woods, I thought, apparently placed there for you to find. A photograph of that moment was delivered to you, which led you to Darren Field, and the two of you had a conversation of some kind. Then Field vanished too. It was after that, after you'd found the connection between Field and the Pied Piper, that you came here looking for Rose and talked to Brian Gill. I stopped as I reached the lock. Finish the thought, my son. You knew because you'd already heard the same story from Darren Field, I thought. Hadn't you, Dad? Field told you that he watched someone being killed, let's assume it was Rose, and that he'd been given the same instruction afterward. A moment of silence. Maybe so, my father said quietly. That sounds plausible, doesn't it? My subconscious had given my father different tones of voice over the past 2 days, but I was struck now by how sad he sounded. For a moment, that didn't make sense. The revelation felt like a breakthrough. But then I realized what the implications of it might be. If Rose Saunders had been taken, it was because she had gone to the police of her own accord. But if Darren Field had chosen not to, if the police, in the form of my father, had come to his door instead, then it might have been my father's visit that had caused his abductor to return a second time, which made his death my father's fault. It would have been inadvertent. Worse than that, my father would effectively have been tricked into doing so. But I still found it easy to imagine the effect that would have had on him, the guilt it would have caused. He had always been a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Like Rose, he had been someone who felt things very deeply indeed. Dad, I thought. But then quiet music broke the silence, and the spell along with it. I felt a vibration against my side, my phone ringing. I took it out of my jacket pocket and looked at the screen. Island, police, the same number that Fleming had originally called me from. I took a deep breath now and accepted the call. Yes? Is this Daniel Garvey? A man's voice. Not one I recognized, and certainly not Fleming. But I imagined that after our encounter last night, he would be more than happy to palm off the task of updating me to one of his subordinates. But that didn't change the fact that if someone was calling me, then there must have been a development of some kind. I braced myself. Yes, it is, I said. What's happened? There was a faint crackle of static in the background. I imagined the officer reading whatever he was about to tell me from a computer screen, or possibly even just a hastily written note. To his credit, he at least managed to sound sympathetic when he spoke next. It's your father, Dr. Garvey. Yes. I'm very sorry to have to tell you this, he said. But his body has been found. 17. The island is still stuck far enough in the past to have a handful of working public telephone boxes, and this one is close to the end of the pier. John has chosen to use it over the past few days, partly for convenience, but mostly because he knows that, despite its handy location, it exists in a CCTV black spot. In the event that anyone traces the calls and searches for evidence, there will be no proof that it was him who made them. Not that you're doing anything wrong, he thinks. But he doesn't believe that. It feels more likely that he's done everything wrong. He glances around the street and then steps into the booth and closes the door. It's cramped and grubby inside, and when he picks up the handset, it feels slightly greasy in his hand. Claustrophobic, dirty, difficult to get a grip on. That all seems fitting. It's how his whole world has felt since he talked to Brian Gill on the barge and confirmed what had happened to Rose Saunders. He feeds coins into the slot and dials a number from memory. Then he leans against the side of the box, staring out through the plastic at a gray smear of sea and hoping to God that it will be a man's voice that answers his call this time. It rings for a while. When someone eventually picks up, they say nothing. John waits. There's an obvious presence in the silence on the other end of the line, and he can tell that they sense him here too. The two of them are stuck at an impasse right now, and for their own very different reasons, neither of them is prepared to break it. This is the third day in a row that he has dialed this number, the first being immediately after returning from that visit to the barge. Darren Field's wife had spoken to him that time. No, I'm sorry, she said. Darren's not here right now. That's fine, he told her. I'll try again tomorrow. Not a problem. After hanging up, he'd done his best to convince himself that what he'd just said to her was true, that there was not necessarily any kind of problem at all. When he'd spoken to Gill, he'd taken the initiative a little, second-guessing what Rose's account of events might have been. The fact that he had been right, and that it echoed what Darren Field had told him so closely, could hardly be a coincidence. However outlandish the stories might have been individually, they corroborated each other. But that didn't mean anything had happened to Field since. Even accepting the stories at face value, even if every word of them was true, Field had done what the killer told him, hadn't he? There was no way in which Rose deserved what had happened to her, but she had broken the rules and gone to the police, whereas the only person Field had spoken to about what had happened was John. And he isn't police anymore. But he had begun to wonder about that. Whoever was responsible for this had not only taken a photograph of John in the woods with the woman's body, but had hand-delivered it to the house afterward. The killer knew that much about John. And even if he was aware that John was no longer police, perhaps to him that was a distinction without a difference. John had tried the number again yesterday, and Field's wife had answered the call again. This time, she had sounded more frightened, and he had heard the desperation in the hello she'd offered, followed immediately by the frustration when John had asked her if Darren was home. It was obvious she had been hoping the call would have been from someone else. "No, he isn't," she'd said. "I don't know where Darren is. Who is?" John had hung up. He waits now, the silence heavy in his ear. There's no point in asking the question. Darren Field isn't there. He can sense the same feeling of desperation as yesterday, and realizes he doesn't want to take the hope away from her by speaking and revealing himself once again. Because deep down, whatever he tries to tell himself, he is certain that he has already done enough damage to this family. The silence stretches out for a few more seconds. "Darren?" Field's wife whispers. John says nothing. "Is that you, baby?" She starts crying. "Please come home." "I'm sorry. I'll do anything." John hangs up. "What have you done?" His vision stars over suddenly, and he places a hand against the dirty plastic of the phone box to steady himself, then lowers his head and takes a series of deep breaths. Minutes pass. And then, finally, he looks up and nods to himself. "What have you done?" That question stays with him all the way home. It feels like some variation of it has been with him his whole life. The self-hatred and worthlessness have been inside him. Since childhood, like a well of lava that erupts occasionally, shattering the crust. The last few years might have been peaceful on the surface, but the feelings have always been there, only ever hidden slightly underneath. And they emerge with ferocity now. You're worthless. You're stupid and small. A failure. A fool. As always, it doesn't matter whether these things are true, only that it feels like they are. Before now, he's always been able to deal with them, the shame and disgust like pieces of food stuck in his throat that just need to be fought down and swallowed. But this time, the consequences of his failure are too much. By the time he gets home, they're choking him. He locks the front door and heads up to his room. For a moment, he stands looking up at the shelves of box files above the desk. The cold cases he's investigated over the years. All that research, all those scribbled notes. Playing policeman. If so, it had always seemed like a game without stakes, a harmless hobby for an old man to fill his time with. What damage could it do to investigate them? And people might laugh, but nobody really knew what he might end up achieving, because people underestimated him. His very first box file is still open on the desk, all the old paperwork from the beginning of his investigation into the Pied Piper strewn around it. His original cold case, begun all those years ago. His and Daniel's. He leans on the desk, staring down at it, remembering. In the first year that Daniel was away at university, it took John a while to get used to being in the house by himself. Even though he and his son had lived almost separate lives for the past few years, he felt Daniel's absence keenly. The door to the attic might have always been closed, but it was different knowing there was no longer anyone behind it. That if he worked up the courage to go up those stairs and knock, there was nobody there to answer. So he threw himself into his new project. After coming home from work every day, he dedicated his evenings to his research. Over the course of that first year, he read every article he could find on the Pied Piper. He accessed all the available information on the police investigation, ordered copies of old newspapers, joined online forums, and made pages and pages of notes. He became gripped by the idea that in solving the mysteries at the heart of the case, he might come to understand his son and heal the damage that had been done to them both. If I do this, everything will be okay. And the year had passed. By the end, his research was an all-consuming mission, but one increasingly driven by a sense of panic, the feeling that time was running out. At the start, he had dared to hope he might find something that everyone else had missed, but all that year proved to him was how thorough the official investigation had been, and how ill-equipped he was to add anything to it. There was no obvious way forward in identifying the Pied Piper. And if the boy at the rest area had not been Robbie Garforth, then he was an enigma. A boy who appeared to have left no discernible trace on the world at all, either before that day or after it. When Daniel returned for the summer holiday, there was no reconciliation between them. They spent that handful of weeks together much as they had in previous years, retreating to their separate spaces, closing their doors. Only now, it wasn't a lack of courage that kept John from going up the stairs and knocking, but shame. He had hoped that by identifying the boy Daniel had seen at the rest area that day, he might be able to bridge the distance between himself and his son. And he had failed. Worthless, stupid, old man. At the end of the holiday, Daniel headed off back to university. John, hungover, had given him an awkward hug at the dock and noticed that Daniel seemed broader and stronger than he remembered. Away from home, and it wasn't possible for John to shake the thought, away from him, his son had begun to flourish. A part of him had understood that Daniel was leaving the island behind him in more ways than one. At that point, John had turned his attention to other cases. Just as a hobby, he began to expand his collection of box files, focusing on one cold case after another, flitting between them whenever some new development offered a fresh angle. They were distractions. He never held out real hope of solving any of them. Perhaps that was even part of the appeal. They were like stories in which he could just study chapters over and over, losing himself in the detail, never worrying about reaching the end. They didn't matter to him. They weren't personal. But he always left that original box file apart from the others, with space beside it on the shelf. It was as though a part of him knew he wasn't done with it just yet, that his worst crime after that first year hadn't been failing during it, but giving up at the end, because that was not who he was. He was not a man who gave up. He was a man who kept going. What have you done? John looks through the paperwork from that first file again now. He remembers how it felt the other night as he was searching for the connection that was eluding him. But the butterflies in his stomach are long gone now. There is only guilt and self-disgust. What on earth had he been thinking? Had he really expected that he might be able to deal with this himself? He puts the paperwork away and slides the box file back into place on the shelf. There is no gap beside it now. Over the years, that space has been taken up by the 7 others he's filled since, and as he stares at those, a different question occurs to him. Not what he's done, but what he didn't. That brings another sharp stab of guilt, and he blinks quickly and turns away to face the punch bag. Worthless, stupid. Whenever his emotions have erupted, he has taken them out on that, but the ones inside him right now are too huge, too damning. He might have caused Darren Field's death, and that's a weight and pain he can't bear. The sight of the bag reminds him that he was hitting it when he realized what his connection to Field might be. At the time, he'd been wondering what the best thing to do was. The emotions inside him now provide an answer to that question. He sits down at the desk, picturing the reach, the place that has called to him so often over the years. In the past, he's always resisted. But a voice in his head now demands, how much better would the world be if you hadn't? He takes out a fresh sheet of paper. Notify my son, he writes.